I'm really excited about today's topic. A friend of mine, Ari Witten, wrote an article questioning whether adrenal fatigue is real. We've been in the natural health community, we've been talking about adrenal fatigue for many years as a possible cause of fatigue, or as the main cause of fatigue. Many people actually base their entire practices on the treatment of adrenal fatigue. So this is a very important topic and one that I definitely value. And so I was really excited to hear about Ari's work, because he is just a wonderful wealth of knowledge and really does a wonderful job looking at the research. So before we jump in, for those of you who are new, welcome. We're really excited that you're here. I am Dr. Evan Hirsch. I'm a medical doctor, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people resolve their chronic fatigue and achieve the best energy of their lives. And so I'm doing it by trying to get this information out there as much as possible. This free Facebook group, the book that I wrote that I dumped all my protocols into. I'm coming out with online courses, group coaching, and then right now I still have the one-on-one coaching. And I have about 10 spots left before I close for the next 6 months or so, if any of you would like to work with me. So if you would, go to my website, fixyourfatigue.org, and click on the Apply to Work With Me button, and we'll see if we're a good fit. So let's dive in here. I printed out Ari's Is Adrenal Fatigue Real? The summary, and so I'm going to kind of go through these one at a time and give you guys my thoughts. So number one, the adrenal fatigue theory is not supported by the research, and I absolutely agree. Ari has definitely proven that without a doubt. Now, his suppositions, for those of you who are not familiar with this work, his suppositions or his predictions are that, or he's going in trying to prove or disprove that cortisol is related to fatigue in some way. There's this thought, and I've believed it for some time as well, that low cortisol levels are associated with chronic fatigue. Okay, so that's what he's going into and trying to research and figure out, is this in fact true? And so his first summary point is the adrenal fatigue theory is not supported by research. That's absolutely true. He proves that. He goes through all of the research and shows that there is no correlation between cortisol levels and fatigue for people who have chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit deeper, and in some places where I agree and disagree with him. Now, adrenal fatigue, I agree with him as well, is a lousy term, because fatigue has many causes, and I believe one of which is adrenal dysfunction, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Number two, studies have been conducted by researchers all over the world for 2 decades examining whether this is a primary cause of chronic fatigue burnout. 20 years of research into this has failed to show any type of HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or cortisol abnormality that is reliably found in people with chronic fatigue burnout. Yes, he has definitely proven that in this article. Overall, the research indicates that the majority of people with chronic fatigue burnout have normal cortisol levels. Thus, cortisol levels cannot reasonably be said to be the cause of chronic fatigue if it's not even detectable in the majority of people with chronic fatigue. So here's a great question. So the first question that I have for the research that's being done is what lab is being used? Is this a blood test? Is this a salivary test? And if the blood test is being used, what is the range on the blood test? Because what I have found is that the range that I use is much different than the normal quote-unquote range that the labs use. And mine comes from 10 years of experience, as well as talking to endocrinologists and a number of other people. And I've narrowed that window to determine exactly what low looks like and what normal looks like. Okay. Now, that said, the other point that I would like to make on that is that it's not all about the cortisol. So the adrenal produces many different hormones. It has 3 different layers. It produces cortisol. It produces something called aldosterone. It produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are huge stress hormones. And so it's very possible, and I agree that based off of his article, that cortisol is not a good marker. I'll say that again, cortisol is not a good marker when you're looking at overall adrenal function. It's one of the best markers that we have, but it's not a good marker, because sometimes somebody will come in and they have all of the symptoms of adrenal dysfunction, but their cortisol levels are fine. Okay? And so that's very important to note. And it may be, and he also looks to disprove or talks about the different phases of cortisol, but I believe that they are in a different phase of their cortisol production. It depends on how they slept the night before. And most people who have chronic fatigue have problems sleeping. It has to do with what they're eating. So cortisol levels can vary incredibly. And so it's really important that you're taking it in context with symptoms. And this is why when I lecture to doctors, I tell them, if you lean on your labs too hard, you will fall over, because it is not all about the labs. You have to take into account the symptoms. You have to look at the symptoms associated with adrenal dysfunction and see whether they're playing a role in here. Because I will treat people based off of their adrenal symptoms before I will treat them based off their cortisol levels. Now that said, I do use blood morning cortisol levels, and I do have a lot of correlation between diagnosis or somebody coming in, and I find that there a correlation between their symptoms and their cortisol levels. So I say, well, it looks like, based off of your symptoms, you should have low cortisol. We run the lab, the cortisol levels are low. I give them adrenal replacement, and it helps. And then the next time I see them, they're feeling, 1 or 2 points better. Okay. The other important point to make here, well, I'll probably get to that in a second. Well, I'll say it now. The other important point to make here is that there are 15 different causes of chronic fatigue. And adrenal dysfunction is only one of those causes. Okay, so this is an incredibly important point. So most of the research, if not all of it, that Ari is looking at is cortisol related to chronic fatigue? Is there an association between the cortisol level and fatigue symptoms? Or if you give somebody adrenal support, does it affect their fatigue significantly? And if they have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 15 of these other causes, then boosting their adrenals or giving them adrenal support is not going to change their symptoms. Okay, that's a very important point. When there are multiple causes, there's no way for you to just look at one cause and look at all of those symptoms of chronic fatigue and say, oh, because, we gave you adrenal support and it didn't help, that means that, cortisol is a lousy marker, as well as adrenal support not being helpful for chronic fatigue. So that's not what the research is showing. Okay. The next one is cortisol levels are not a valid biomarker of fatigue or burnout. And I would really, this research has really shown a lot of support for that. So now I'm scratching my head and thinking, okay, what else should I be using to assess for adrenal dysfunction? Because my supposition is, based off of this work by Ari, is that something else is going on with the adrenals. We know that epinephrine and norepinephrine are stress responders. And we know that they can get out of whack. Maybe we should be testing those. Maybe they are more important than testing for cortisol. It's not something we typically do. But it's very interesting, the things that we choose to do and the things that we don't, with certain hormones. Why do we test thyroid hormone? And conventionally, we don't test sex hormones. If you're a conventional doctor, gynecologist, whatever, and someone goes into menopause and you give them estrogen, you're never going to check, most of the time, they never check the estrogen levels. But when we give somebody thyroid, we check the thyroid levels. Why is that? And a lot of times, it's just precedent. And so the same thing goes here. Why do we check one thing and not the other? And this is where some of the urine testing, I think, could be really helpful, by the Dutch test and some of these other Meridian Valley labs, where you can look at all of the hormones in the pathway and you can really get a better idea about what's happening when. And Jonathan Wright proposes that we should actually be looking at the metabolites of adrenal function, adrenal physiology, and not cortisol levels. So he's already kind of looking at some of that information. So great questions. So is cortisol level a valid biomarker? I would say probably not, but it is part of the puzzle. We do have to take it with a grain of salt. Let's see. Yet the vast majority of people with chronic fatigue or burnout from stress have no cortisol abnormalities at all. Thus, cortisol levels are not a valid biomarker of chronic fatigue. Okay. Number 6, cortisol levels measurements are not a valid way of diagnosing people with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, burnout versus normal healthy people. I would agree. It always has to be history, symptoms, labs, physical exam, and it has to be the right labs like we're talking about. So I would definitely agree with that statement. And then bioindividuality, which is very interesting. What if the correct range for cortisol is different for me than it is for Gregory, who's watching this video? What if I really need to be around a 20 on cortisol and he needs to be at a 25 in order to be functioning optimally? Then all of this research has to be thrown out if that is the case, if that bioindividuality negates any sort of range. That's why we try to make the range in the optimal range as possible, and we try to include all of those people who have that symptom or have that illness, but it's not always possible. All right, number 7. Even studies that do find cortisol abnormalities show only very slight abnormalities and typically still show normal overall 24-hour cortisol output. Okay, great. Number 8, low salivary cortisol levels are not actually evidence of adrenal fatigue, and research that assessing total 24-hour cortisol urine output via urine shows that the majority of people who have low salivary cortisol levels actually have normal total 24-hour urine cortisol production by the adrenal glands. Okay. Number 9, there are no cortisol abnormalities present at the onset or early stages of chronic fatigue. And so I would agree with that. Most of the time, if somebody is going to have adrenal dysfunction, the body is able to compensate for a certain amount of time until it's no longer able. So it really depends on where they are in that pathway, where the cortisol is, where the DHEA sulfate is, which really has to do more with our adrenal reserves. Because your cortisol might be fine, but if your reserves are bad, then you're going to have symptoms of reserves. Or your cortisol might be low, but your reserves are good, vice versa. So I think that that number 9 is incorrect. I would disagree with that statement. Number 10, cortisol level measurements are not a valid way of assessing the severity of chronic fatigue. And I would say yes. Though there are situations where I do see a correlation between very low cortisol and people who have very bad chronic fatigue. So, and the other thing that he was finding in this research was that elevated levels, people who had chronic fatigue also had elevated levels. And I think that has to do with this dysfunction. I think that the adrenals are kind of going like this throughout the day if they're not working right. They're supposed to be, elevated in the morning. They start being produced at midnight, elevated by 6 a.m., and then kind of come down throughout the day so you can sleep. And if you're doing this sort of thing, I think that has to do a lot with when the cortisol is tested in the morning, where they are in terms of these jagged lines, in terms of whether they are elevated or low, depressed. Number 11, cortisol level measurements are not a valid way of assessing the cause of chronic fatigue. I would agree. I would say they are a part, but they are not to be taken as an absolute. Number 12, cortisol level measurements are not a valid way of directing the course or treatment for chronic fatigue. So we did look at some research, especially the work of William Jeffries, to look at, okay, if somebody has low cortisol, you give them cortisol, does it affect their symptoms? And once again, it has to do with the number of causes that people have. It's not just one thing that's causing this chronic fatigue. And part of this, a lot of this comes from my clinical experience. Ari's wonderful at the research, and I would say that I'm pretty good at the clinical stuff. And what I see is I'll see people come in, I'll look at their symptoms, I'll look at their cortisol levels, I'll address their adrenals, and consequently they're going to get better. Now I'm also working on a lot of other things. I'm looking at their thyroid. I'm looking at their sex hormones. You know, I'm starting to detoxify. I'm removing toxins and treating infections and heavy metals, chemicals, molds, all those things. So it is a bigger picture, but I do find that there is a direct correlation when their cortisol is low. I give them adrenal support, and then the next time they come in or the next time we test, their cortisol level is better. And I increase it, you know, if I need to increase the adrenal support more, then we retest, and then it's even better. So there does seem to be that correlation in my experience with what I've seen. So that those are anecdotes. You know, that's not research. It is anecdotes. But when you look at what evidence-based medicine is, evidence-based medicine is either you have the opinion of 3 people who are specialists in the area, or you're looking at the research, or you're looking at precedent. So those are kind of the main things that you look at when you're looking at evidence-based medicine. And so in terms of looking at 3 specialists, a lot of that has to do with the fact that experience does play a role when you're looking at evidence-based medicine. You have to take that into account. Cortisol testing has many methodologic flaws that can often lead to false diagnoses of low cortisol levels when a person doesn't actually have low cortisol levels. Yes, I absolutely agree. The adaptogenic herbs often prescribed to people who have been told they have adrenal fatigue are only shown in scientific research to lower cortisol levels, not raise them. It does not make sense to prescribe substances that lower cortisol if the claim is that chronic fatigue is being caused by cortisol levels that are already too low. I absolutely agree with that, but the supposition, I think, is incorrect from the rest of the natural medicine establishment that it's everybody's got low cortisol levels when you have chronic fatigue. I think that it's this. You've got aberrant, you've got dysfunctional cortisol levels, or dysfunctional epinephrine, norepinephrine levels as well. And remember, the adrenal gland produces sex hormones. In addition to a lot of these other hormones too. So there's a big interplay with what's actually happening with the adrenal glands. Number 17, lower cortisol levels, when they do occur in a small subset of people with fatigue, are almost certainly not the result of the adrenal gland being fatigued and unable to produce enough cortisol. I would agree with that statement. Let me read it again. Lower cortisol levels, when they do occur in a small subset of people with fatigue, are almost certainly not the result of adrenal gland being fatigued and unable to produce enough cortisol. Yes, he talks a bit about the different patterns that can produce lower cortisol numbers. And so it's important to remember that there are other causes. But I would suggest that a lot of those other causes that he mentioned are producing inflammation in the body. He talked about people who had elevated weight, are producing inflammation in the body, which in turn is requiring an anti-inflammatory, usually cortisol, to produce this anti-inflammatory effect that ends up mitigating some of the inflammation. So that will end up increasing the amount of cortisol produced, and then over the long term decreasing it. So that might be what that pattern is that's being seen. Let's see. I'm going to skip to the bolded spots in the interest of time. A lowered morning peak in cortisol levels is not evidence of adrenal fatigue, since it can be found in healthy, non-chronically fatigued people who are simply sleep-driven, sedentary on certain medications, or are night owls. So I think that, this new paradigm, or the way that I see adrenal dysfunction is how I am describing this, so that you can kind of understand why some of these things might be seen in the research. Cortisol levels typically do not change in response to interventions that improve symptoms and or normalize health. I already talked about that. And fixing cortisol levels does not fix fatigue. Absolutely. If you've got 14 other causes of fatigue, fixing your cortisol levels is not going to fix fatigue. The focus on cortisol levels in chronic fatigue burnout appears to be extremely misguided. I agree with that. We need a new paradigm when it comes to talk about the adrenals, and I think that Ari's done a wonderful job of opening the door for this and saying, what else is going on? Let's talk about this. Let's be scientists. Let's make a hypothesis and let's test it and let's see if it's true. Let's see if it's real. Now, is this going to change? The question that I always ask. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this. We talked about labs. We talked about And I generally tell people all labs are imperfect, all labs. And so it's always important to combine with symptoms. All lab ranges are imperfect. The other thing that I didn't see Ari mention is that there's lots of mitochondria in the adrenal gland, which could be why there's a decrease in energy when there are seeming problems with the adrenal gland. So the question is always, when I look at research, is this going to change my treatment? And the answer is no. The answer is because the way that I was treating was already somewhat in line with what Ari's doing here. Symptoms, looking at the cortisol levels as more of a dysfunction and not necessarily as low cortisol. And the treatment that I use, the Eleuthero route by the Adrenal PX by Restorative Formulations that I really like, it works as an adaptogenic herb, but it's wonderful for fixing that adrenal dysfunction. I think that's more of what we're looking at. And it's not just about boosting adrenals, though I will try to reset the curve and do some of these other things. But incredibly valuable information from Ari. Great scientific gathering. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, Ari, my good friend. And I'm really excited to chat more about what the new theory, this new paradigm should really be. And if you guys have questions, please, why don't you go ahead and ask them now. Looks like Kristen has a question. Explains why Dr. Berg's adrenals and cortisol support isn't very helpful. Well, I don't know anything about his supplement, but perhaps it isn't because you're not addressing all of the causes of your fatigue, or maybe it's not balancing appropriately what you need. So thank you guys so much for watching, and please leave comments, give it a thumbs up. If you're watching it on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button, mash that subscribe button, and so you can always get more videos from me. Thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing day.